happily joined by Jen Mazzi from Integra HR with us this morning. We're going to be discussing managing a remote workforce and really trying to figure out if this is a trend or the way that things are going. But regardless, we're all in the middle of it right now. So we thought this was a great opportunity to start talking about how to do this moving forward. Katie, can you, there we go. So as I said, my name is Sabrina Hauser. Our company is called Capital CFO. Just to tell you a little bit about us, we outsource chief financial officers and bookkeepers for medium-sized companies and nonprofits that need the expertise, just not necessarily full-time. We also offer nonprofit consulting services that go above and beyond the CFO work that we do. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jen to talk a little bit about Integra services. Sorry, Jen, you're still muted.
I'm still muted. Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Sabrina, for having Integra today. And thank you to you and your team for welcoming us as speakers for this virtual webinar. It's a pleasure to be here and again, for everyone to be spending time together this morning. A little bit about Integra. We basically understand that business owners did not start companies and leaders did not join organizations to really understand the complexities of human resources. So we did, and we're there to help people navigate and figure that HR complexity and navigate all of those HR needs that you have on a day-to-day basis. Here's a list of our services. And again, we come in and help our leaders and business owners to incorporate the best HR solid practices and also to get a return on that investment. So again, thank you for having us. So I'll turn it over to Liz this morning.
Thanks, Jen. I'm just going to go over a little bit of housekeeping for everybody, and I work here with Sabrina at Capital CFO, so I'm really happy to be here and really interested in hearing all the information that we're going to learn today. So throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions and comments in the chat box at any time, and Katie and I will be keeping an eye on the chat box, and we will raise your questions as they are raised. And if we do not get to your questions before the end of the webinar, we'll make sure to reach out to you directly after the webinar to answer your questions. If you're calling in by phone, you can email questions directly to me, and my email is liz@capitalcfollc.com. And if you're having any technical difficulties, please reach out to us using the chat box as well, and we'll try to resolve those for you. And then I also want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and we will provide that recording along with all the other resources that are mentioned in this webinar to everyone who is registered and attended after the webinar. And then I also wanted to let you know that we do have a YouTube channel, and the recording of this webinar and all our previous webinars are on that YouTube channel, and you can access that channel via our website. So now I'd like to turn it back over to Jennifer in Integra.
Thank you so much, Liz. So a little bit about our objectives for our time together today. I'm sure many of you have been on a multitude of virtual webinars and meetings, and what we really wanted to try to do is to incorporate a lot of interactive practices into our presentation today. And our first goal is to have some fun. We're going to do some polls throughout our session. We'll review some rules and regulations that you need to consider when we're managing a remote workforce. We're also going to look at remote work policies. We'll also look at extending the culture and how do we do that when we are navigating employees that are working remotely for us or with us. And then also, how do we lead that remote workforce? And lastly, we'll talk about some handouts that we have that we will share. So moving on. So Sabrina mentioned when we first started out, remote work. Is it a perk or a trend in 2021 and beyond? So a lot of us considered in 2020 that this was the year of remote work. And it was just the beginning as we saw that trend continuing into 2021. However, according to a recent article that was done by Forbes, they've done a study, and they are estimating that by 2025, 70% of our workforce will actually be working remotely at least 5 days per month. again going to really be a perk or a trend, or is it really going to be our new reality? So let's do a poll. Our poll is 2020 pushed organizations really beyond the work site, right? Working a hybrid model, or maybe you're working remotely. So what is going on in your organization? What are you doing? Select one. Are you on-site, remote, hybrid, or a combination of all three? We'll give you few more seconds. Thank you so much for sharing those poll results with us. So it looks like the hybrid model is at 50%, on-site only 25%, and then kind of that combination of all three at 25%. So it looks like we're really navigating and having to manage these workforce or our employees remotely. So we'll go on to the next slide. Thanks so much, Katie. So let's talk a little bit about some of the laws and the regulations that we need to consider when we're managing that remote workforce. First and foremost, it's really the wage and hour rules and regulations. It's how many hours have people worked? Are they actually taking their meals and rest periods? The flexible schedules? How are we managing when individuals need to take some time in the morning? Maybe they need to jump on and get their children onto Zoom classes and then navigate back into the workspace. And also these wage and hour rules and regulations, they do vary from state to state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I navigate through my portion of the presentation this morning. In addition, how are we handling overtime? So do you have those electronic timekeeping systems or other processes for accurately recording employees' work hours? And it's critically important because anybody who is hourly and is working more than 40 hours per week does need to be paid at time and a half or their overtime rate. And sometimes when they're working these flexible schedules, they're jumping on and they're saying, oh, that's okay, it's all right. I don't need to record those 10, 15, 20 minutes where I'm working on a particular project or responding to some emails. However, under the wage and hour regulations, you do need to pay your employees unless it's what they would call de minimis. And de minimis basically means that it's a very limited amount of time. Maybe it's 30 seconds or a minute to respond back to one email. But really that overtime does need to be tracked for your hourly staff. So it's critically important to make sure that in your remote work policy that you are requiring all of your employees to record all of their hours worked, that you're setting those clear work hours with them. And if you're allowing them to work flexible hours, that you're addressing that within your remote work policy. And you are expressly prohibiting all off the clock work. So it's not okay for an employee to say, well, that's okay. I'm just going to jump on for 10 or 15 minutes and complete that. And you also must require employees to obtain permission before they're actually working overtime. And that way it will help you to be able to monitor that and make sure that all hours worked are being recorded. So let's jump into our second poll. If we could, Katie, thank you. In that second poll, 2020 saw employees relocating to different states and or employers expanding their talent pools and hiring employees living in different states. So a question for you, do you have one or both of these situations? If so, select one of the following. The answer would be yes, no, or I don't know. Perfect. So We're sharing the poll results. So the majority of the people on the call, 86%, do not have staff that are working in or living in other states. And one individual doesn't know. So thank you so much for sharing that. We'll go on to the next slide. Thanks so much, Katie. So in reference to payroll, unemployment insurance, and income tax implications, for that one individual who doesn't happen to know, it would be good to know whether you do have employees that are working and living in other states. And the reason that I bring this up, even though it may not be relevant to the majority of employers that are on the call with us today, but it's something to be mindful of, because I've had several clients who have learned through the course of their time that all of a sudden somebody has relocated and is working from home in a remote state. So the question to ask is, does your employee work in the same state your business is registered? If so, they're an in-state employee working remotely. If not, they're an out-of-state employee working remotely. So in most of those cases, you would be required to withhold taxes in the state where your employee is actually working. So for example, your company is based in New York, but your employee is now relocated to North Carolina. You would be withholding income tax and paying state unemployment tax in the state of North Carolina. So if we could jump to the next slide. Thanks so much, Katie. So there's a couple of tips and things for you to consider, and 4 general things to do if you have this particular scenario. And the first thing that I want to mention is at Integra, we are not tax advisors, nor are we payroll experts. So I would always encourage you, and tip number 4 is to seek out that specific guidance. But in general, if you do have that employee situation where someone is working and living remotely from New York State, you would need to register your employees within that state tax agency and possibly with the labor and unemployment agencies. You would also need to learn the state's pay and labor laws, things like their minimum wage, pay stub requirements, maybe how often or frequent your pay needs to be. And in the event that you end your employment relationship with that employee, what does their final pay look like? And when does that have to occur? Also, does the state have disability coverage? What are their meal and rest period requirements and workers' compensation? And the list goes on from there, but it does vary from state to state. And the last piece is withholding income taxes and filing the required paperwork and payments as required by that particular state. So we can go on to the next slide, Katie. Thank you. So the next piece to consider would be the anti-discrimination laws and how might this impact your organization. So I'm going to list out a couple of examples. Maybe the first one is your employee requires some special or specific technology or equipment in order to be able to work at home, and you or one of your managers failed to provide that reasonable accommodation. And again, people working in home offices, we're going to talk a little bit about that and the requirement for setup and also work-related injuries. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the most important thing is to remember whether an employee is on-site or whether they're working from home, and if they do need some form of specific or specialized technology and equipment, it is important for you to go through that reasonable accommodation, or what we would call the interactive process. The next example would, maybe you have some remote workers, and maybe they happen to be primarily women, but your on-site workers happen to be primarily men. And in this particular instance, some of your managers don't offer the remote employees the same type of support or maybe the opportunity for advancement as your on-site employees, or you don't pay them the same wage. Again, these are things to be considering when you are looking at your remote work site and your remote populations in preference or in reference to your on-site workers. And is there any disparate impact or anything that's happening that might be disproportionately impacting one group over the other? And making sure that you are putting some things in place to avoid that. The last one is a manager or coworker sends a suggestive email, or maybe they send a photo. and or maybe it's a meme. I had a recent client situation where somebody was sending around memes, and you or your manager failed to address or take action. It is worthy to know that you as the employer are responsible for all interactions. So whether this is going on over your email or over, files that are being shared amongst your employees, that still is the workplace. And therefore you are responsible to make sure that no one is having anything sent that's inappropriate or could rise to the level of creating a hostile work environment.
Jen, I have a question.
Sure.
For that previous slide, when you're talking about remote versus on-site workers,
Sure.
how important, I think there's two things in that number two. There's gender and there's also remote and on-site. How
Sure.
important is the gender piece there? Or is it just really disparity between what you offer on-site workers versus remote workers?
Sure. I think it could potentially be both, right? Because you want to, first and foremost, if it's not a gender-based issue, right? So you do want to make sure that you are looking at things equitably across whether it's a gender-based issue, but also your employees in general, right? You want to be consistent and fair. So if you're affording certain groups an opportunity for advancement or additional support because they happen to be there, right? It's so easy when we're on site working with employees to be able to scoot down the hall or pop into an office to say, hey, how's it going? And sit down and have a conversation and provide them a different level of support. When we are working with our remote workforce, we want to be able to do the same thing. So creating that ease of being able to sit down and say, and maybe if it's not being in person, but over Zoom, or maybe doing some check-ins with people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a little bit to make sure, again, that we're interacting and providing the same types of and same levels of support. And then also looking at, is there any disparity amongst groups? And do you have one particular gender-based issue? And again, this is just one example of many, but hopefully that kind of answers the question where I think you would want to look at it from both perspectives.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. So how do we go about preventing some of these violations? One is you might want to consider re-reviewing your harassment and your discrimination policies. You might want to provide some training and also ensure that employees' rights to training and advancement are available for everyone, whether they're on site or whether they are working for you remotely. It's always a great idea to remind remote workers to continue to abide by all discrimination policies and rules, regardless of where they are physically located. Remember, it's important to know that this can be through text messaging, through your email system, through file sharing. So it doesn't necessarily have to occur on your work site to be deemed as some form of harassment or discrimination. So it's critically important that regardless of where people are, if work is being conducted, that it is free from any form of discrimination. Also, have your remote workers and all of your employees. So if you have a hybrid model, which many of the participants on the call today do, make sure that you're reading through and acknowledging company policies and addressing these issues, even if they've already recently done so. Again, it's always a great way to remind staff about your expectations. Thanks, Katie. So workers' compensation, I had mentioned before a little bit about workers' compensation. When an employee is working from a home office and they have some form of injury, home offices are really seen as that extension of your workplace, and injuries can be just like if that accident had actually occurred at your work site. Your remote employees will generally be entitled to workers' compensation if that worker was injured in the course of what we would deem a work-related activity. So employers can make it easy to evaluate those particular claims and whether they are truly work-related by setting some really clear guidelines for employees' job duties and their working hours. In addition, I do want to recommend that if you have a great relationship with your workers' compensation carrier, I would reach out to them for additional assistance. Many of them have guidelines, checklists, or ways of making suggestions in toolkits that can be provided to your staff to help them to set up their home offices so that they can reduce the amount of or the ability to have a work-related injury, reminding them things of, removing cords and making sure things are plugged in correctly, things of that nature, setting up their workstation so that they aren't injuring their back. And the list goes on. But I would encourage you to reach out to your workers' compensation carrier because they have many, many tools and resources that they would enjoy sharing with you to, again, make sure that those work-related injuries are reduced or don't occur at all. So remote work policies. So in addition to some of the things that we've talked about, you may also want to consider including in your guidelines some of the following things. If, for example, you are believing that right now your hybrid model or your employees that are working remotely is not going to continue forever, you might want to create your remote work policy that has a start and an end date. And the reason for that is to just provide people an opportunity to plan accordingly. Or maybe you're anticipating that by the fall, you would have people coming back in and working on site. And this way, again, they can be planning out how that will look. Or you might want to include in there that you are going to reconsider it at that time and reevaluate. So again, the employees can begin to plan. I think one of the biggest challenges for individuals that are working remote right now is not knowing if or when they're going to be able to come back out on site and participate or be involved like they used to be, right? We all call it, when we used to go back into the office or when we were in the office. So I think it's a good idea to afford people the opportunity to understand what that remote work plan looks like and then when that might be modified to have them back on site. The next piece is setting expectations for work performance and productivity. And it's really key and critical to do this. I was just having a conversation with an employee this morning, and one of the things that we talked about was that productivity, right? And needing to know what are the expectations around when I'm working? Do I have the flexibility when I'm working remotely to get up and go and do what I need to do and come back and start or re-engage in my day? And so as a leader, it's important to talk with your employees about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail in just a little bit. Also, expectations for response time. So for example, maybe an employee needs to know how often or when do I need to be able to respond to an email? Maybe your expectation is you need to do that within 24 hours of receiving it. Or maybe it's by the end of the day that you need to respond to an email when I've sent it out or when a client or when an internal individual has contacted you. So again, those expectations for response time should be clear with employees. Also, it's important, and several states do require this, including New York, where you need to let employees know what you will or you will not be reimbursing for equipment and business expenses. It's important to let them know because when they have created these home offices, some individuals may be deducting some of these expenses off of their personal taxes. However, if you are being reimbursed for those pieces of equipment or business expenses, it may or may not be deductible on your personal income tax. So again, it is important to outline that, and therefore your employee knows what to expect and what will be reimbursed. The next piece that we talked a little bit about earlier was the rest and meal periods. And again, instructing your employees to keep track of and take those unpaid meal periods or uninterrupted meal breaks. Cybersecurity, really big issue. So some employees may or may not have ever set up a home office, and they may not have had internet connectivity. I've worked with some clients that have those situations. So it's critically important when they're setting up their home offices to make sure that they have a password on their Wi-Fi as well as their network connections. Therefore, making sure that there's some form of firewall on their internet connectivity and some security to make sure that the information as it's going back and forth is protected. Also, again, protecting that confidential information or any information that you might deem confidential in your business to, again, make sure that no information is being shared with someone who should not be receiving that information, or that someone cannot hack in and get access to it. So making sure that there's some forms of encryption software, other tools or resources being offered to your remote staff. Again, that health and safety of their home office. So again, those workers' compensation guidelines to make sure that those things are implemented for your staff. In addition, that technology and equipment guidelines, who can actually use it? So for example, maybe this is the first time that an employee has a piece of your equipment at home, your printers, your laptops or desktops that you provided to them. And they're just going to have maybe their significant other or maybe their child jump onto it. But maybe you don't want to have their family members or a roommate or whomever accessing your equipment. So again, it's good to be able to provide them with that guidance and information about what is or isn't allowed and who is or isn't allowed to use your technology or equipment. And lastly, it's really important to make sure that your policy talks about employees keeping their data up to date, whether that's a change in emergency contact, an address, or a phone number, because it's critically important to be able to have access to that information. Next slide. Thank you. So additional HR considerations. Things that you might want to be thinking about now that you have a remote workforce or you are leaning towards continuing to have a remote workforce. How are your hiring and your job interview processes going to go? What are they going to look like? Are you going to have one person on a Zoom call? Are you still going to do phone screens and then at some point have an in-person interview with social distance guidelines and practices in place? Or are you going to do everything remote and it's just going to be Zoom interactions? So again, just some things to think about when you are putting your remote policies and practices into place. Also, how is onboarding going to look like? What is that going to feel like? What about the paperwork and the forms? What are the mechanics of that and the workflow? How are signatures going to work? Is this something that you're going to need to guide employees or future employees about so that they know how to sign documents electronically? How are you going to process I-9s? So I-9s are a very interesting form, right? That's your immigration form. That's the form that all employees fill out in the first few days of employment that say that they're allowed to work legally in the United States. And last year during the pandemic, we had a little bit of a reprieve, right? We could do things remotely via Zoom. And the identification documents that an employee would provide to us, we could just look at it over Zoom and document that on the I-9 form. Well, in September of 2020, that changed. And they said any employers that have any portion of their business back on site, they must go back and re-review those I-9 forms. And what that means is they need to actually physically look at the documents and recertify or reattest that those documents and that that person is legally able to work in the United States. If a portion of your workforce is remote and continues to be remote, that's okay, but you still need to be able to see these things in person. If you do not have the capability to be able to do that, what you need to do is find someone, what they call an agent of the business. And that can be a couple of options for you would be, maybe it's a consultant that you hire in that particular location to meet with the employee and see those documents and attest. It could be the employee's family member, or maybe that person has a financial institution where they could go, a bank or a credit union, and that person could go and meet with somebody that works in their customer service or member service department, and they could attest to seeing the documents on your behalf. But again, In the meantime, if you are completely 100% remote and have no one working on site, right now you can just do that remotely. However, if you do have a portion of your work site actually back in and working, then you would be obligated to be seeing these documents and completing this form in person or having an agent completing it in person for you. If you have questions about that, you're welcome to reach out. Next is, how would you get the equipment and the resources and the tools that they need to the employee who's working or continuing to work for you remotely? Also, again, we've already touched on it, but the workers' compensation and the home office setup. So making sure that their home office is set up and that cybersecurity or the security training. So do you have an IT a department or an IT consultant that can help deliver some of this training or help them to set up, if they've never set up this type of equipment at home, to walk them through those steps? Performance management. So how are you going to set up your performance management and what's that going to look like for you? So is this going to be something that you're going to do over a Zoom call? Are these the types of things that you will meet in person to do one-to-one? Or again, is it going to be something that you're going to do over phone calls? So again, what will that look like for your leaders and your staff? Trainings. How are you going to train your staff? So are you going to provide interactive training? Are you going to provide in-person training where it's socially distanced? So again, some things that you need to consider are, how are you going to continue to deliver the types of trainings that your employees have come to know or your new employees need going forward, especially in that remote setting? Safety planning and training. So maybe you have, again, a hybrid model. Many of the participants on the call today say they have a hybrid model. So you have this portion of your staff that are working remotely. Well, what happens when they come back to the office or they need to come into the office for a meeting or to stop by to drop off a piece of equipment or get a new piece of equipment or get some paperwork from you? Have they been trained on your safety and reopening plans? So again, it is important to make sure that not only your on-site staff are trained, but your remote staff is trained. So in the event that they need to come on site, that they are able to do that in a safe manner. How will corrective actions work, right? Your disciplinary process. So again, very much like performance management, are these things that are you going to continue to do remotely, or are those things that you really want to be able to do in person, and how will that process work? And making sure that your leaders are trained on that. Recognition and rewards and social and business gatherings. So what tools and resources are you going to provide to your leaders to be able to recognize and reward staff, as well as do you allow people to use your Zoom or your Google Meets or Google Hangout or your instant messaging tools to be able to gather or have conversations back and forth of a bit of a more social nature, right? Because we know when we're in the office, when we need that, few minute break, we gather like in a lunchroom, or we might stop into someone's office to say, hey, how are you doing today? And so it's really critically important to engage with our employees so that they don't feel so isolated, to be able to have those kinds of interactions, even though they're working remotely. And the last couple are terminations and off-boarding. So in the event that you need to end or someone resigns from your business, how are you going to off-board that individual? And then how do you collect all of that equipment, resources, and tools? Next slide. So 4 ways that you can extend your culture remotely and kind of answer some of the things that we talked about are: 1, share your knowledge, right? Share your news, updates, the status of the company, and do this via maybe virtual staff meetings. And you want to encourage employees to share their knowledge and give them access to tools and resources and platforms to facilitate those interactions. You want to recognize people digitally, right? 5 high fives of that I mentioned before, right? You can't just hop in and say, hey, great job on that. So leaders really must consider new ways to be able to recognize their teams, maybe using emojis or other visuals to help clarify the intent of those communications and really be able to celebrate people that you're working with every day. Send some swag. If you've got some company items and like mugs or a t-shirt, anything, right? Send it to your remote team. And also if they, you know that they are working alongside a family member, they've got roommates, send some along for them as well. It's just a fun way of getting something in the mail and recognizing that the work that they're doing on behalf of you and the company. And also meet in person. So eventually, right? Technology is a wonderful tool, but it does not really replace that human-to-human connection. And so it's really important to consider when it's appropriate to meet with them. Again, it's that building of the bond, the trust, and the relationship, and also to have a bit of fun. Next slide. So, effectively leading that remote workforce. Set those clear expectations and review things like your mission and vision, your goals, those scheduled hours, resources and tools, the preferred communication methods and channels and timing, that contact information and guidelines for support. So who are you supposed to be reaching out and contacting if you need some additional resources? Who owns the actual project and task, and who is it being assigned to? And also that team availability, the when, the where, and the how that everyone can be reached. Connect consistently and avoid that disconnection or isolation. It's important, schedule those routine virtual meetings. Designate specific times, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly, for the entire team to connect. And one of the things that I've read about recently, which I absolutely love, we used to call it the open door policy when we were in the office, is that open status policy. And that's your online status. So you're letting people know I'm busy, I'm away, or I'm available, and making sure that it's accurate so that people know that they can reach out to you, or this isn't a good time because you're busy and your calendar shows that. So again, it's just communicating in all facets that you have available to you. And probably one of the biggest keys is choosing the right communication channel. So the phone, right? Those are for when you have to have those more intricate or detailed or long conversations, and sometimes emotional conversations where it wouldn't be appropriate to send something that would be difficult or emotional for the person receiving it to do an email. Emails are really intended for those objective and brief interactions. And chats is more of the informal messaging, announcement, news, quick team updates, or collaborating, or maybe some socializing. And your video platforms are really for those focused, long, feedback-rich, emotional, or difficult conversations. But I do find that managers and/or employees struggle with what is the right communication channel. Next slide. Thanks, Katie. So effectively leading a remote workforce, again, communicate transparently. Allow a remote team to function smoothly as a single unit. You need to make information transparent, and using file sharing services like Google Docs and Teams. You want to track and measure progress proactively. I had briefly mentioned earlier that I was talking with somebody about really understanding what that productivity looks like. And one of the things that you want to be able to consider is, how is this employee to know, right? Are you really looking at the quantity of work? So how many hours that they're working? Are you working at the quality of what they're producing? And really setting those clear expectations, because we are finding that time just behind a computer screen means maybe you're busy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are being productive. And working with your employees to set those expectations so that they know and have that flexibility. So again, you want to track and measure progress proactively. So look at some time tracking systems, some time or task management or activity tracking tools, things like Asana, there's Trello, there's I've Done This, that helps aggregate that daily activity and helps you be able to accomplish things and people to stay on track. And then last but not least is really monitoring people's well-being. You want to set those boundaries between their personal and work life, right? I think one of the biggest things that I hear, and I know Sabrina's going to talk about this in just a couple of moments, is that fear, right? That employees might not be engaging, they may not be working. And just because they're home does not mean that they're not actually being productive and working. And it can be really challenging for employees to decipher between, and they're feeling this blend of, am I at work or am I at home, or I'm never really leaving my house, so I'm still at work. And they're working many, many hours. And again, just because somebody doesn't respond to an email right away doesn't mean that they are being low performing or lazy and not responding to you. Maybe they're just not understanding what your expectations are about when to respond. So the greater danger really with the remote workers is that these employees will overwork themselves and tend to burn out. So I will leave it at that. Certainly open to any other questions, if there are any, before I turn it over to Sabrina.
We don't have any questions in the chat box, and in the interest of time, I think we'll let Sabrina get started and our participants can give some thought. If they have any questions, to just throw them in the chat box at any time, because we will have some time at the end as well. And thank you so much, Jen. So we'll move on to Sabrina's portion.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much, Jen. That was so informative. And I'm really only going to take a couple of minutes to talk you through a couple of personal choices I made for an agency that I ran and how I set up my business. I shared with everybody on the call, all the facilitators today, that I am not a trendsetter in any way. But this was one trend that I started way before the pandemic. So I kind of feel like I'm going to pat myself on the back for that, because I'm never first in line to do anything. But I actually started remote working back in 2006. So Katie, if you can go to the next slide. I started it when I was a manager of an agency that I became the CEO and CFO for, and I was managing the nonprofit and just really saw a lot of inefficiencies. I saw a ton of downtime. I saw that the hours that the employees were in office were not aligning with the work that needed to be done. And I saw an opportunity to kind of reduce expenses. I will say that in conjunction to remote working, another area that I tiptoed into was full-time versus part-time work, but that's a whole other workshop and seminar that we can do a different time. So here were some of the pros, and these were pros that kind of came to me, not at all my expectations, but I attracted a largely diverse workforce when I went to remote versus on-site in person. And not only were they diverse, which was so important to me and my agency, I also attracted a really experienced and talented workforce. So it was first an opportunity for somebody to kind of use the agency as a stepping stone to their next level. Really became seasoned workers that had a lot of experience and a lot of background that just needed some flexibility in their schedule, and remote working really aligned those two. I did as I wanted to do, decrease inefficiencies and expenses. We did have a team of 30, but I only needed space for 6. And even those 6 utilized the office at different times. So even those 6 that were on site, we were much more of a hybrid model where people were both on and off site, and definitely were remote workers as well. Some of the cons, we did have to keep all of the team on one page, and teams that were working in teams sometimes felt like they were part of a silo if we didn't do this. So for example, if I belong to one section of the agency and there's 3 others that hold the same job title as me, if we're not all meeting regularly to talk about procedures, processes, how we do this, stumbling blocks, bottlenecks, if we didn't start those meetings at least monthly, if not twice a month, then those people started to feel like, okay, I'm kind of on my own and doing this on my own, and there's nobody else to bounce ideas off of. Making sure that they had a supervisor that they could connect with was very important. So we started supervision hours where they had to meet with their supervisor either once a week or twice a month. Somebody that they felt that they could connect with and actually run questions by was extremely important. And as Jen talked about, that life-work balance that you need to keep in the forefront, not only as an employee, but as an employer, and setting very specific times. Those times may not look like 9 to 5. They may not. And I think one thing that Jen said when we first started talking about this session and webinar that always kind of stayed with me is your team's availability and meeting them when, where, and how works best for them. So if we go to the next slide, since I started this in 2006, when I actually started my own company at the end of 2016, I made a choice that my company was going to be fully remote. I don't have bricks and mortar. I don't have to have that expense in my budget. My team either works from home or they're working on site with my clients. Flexibility was always hugely important, not only to me as an employer, but I wanted to make sure that I really invested in that flexibility with my team. And what I tell my team members is you get to tell me how many hours you want to work. You get to tell me, what your work cycle looks like, and I will fit the client that meets that to you. Does it always work that way? No, but the fact that I'm starting the conversation that way makes my team feel like I'm more invested in them. And if you invest in your team, that trickles down to the clients. It's probably one of the biggest lessons that I learned. My team is able to work anywhere and with anyone, which also means that my clients do not have to stay within my 4 to 6 county range. One of my directors does not live in my state. She was somebody that I worked with for years and years and years and always wanted to work with her again. But since she wasn't local, how are we to do that? Well, now that remote working is so easy, it's no longer a problem. And now that all of this has become way more normalized, everybody feels very comfortable with it. That being said, my clients aren't just Capital Region clients. I'm able to work with clients in California, New York City, Washington State, Washington, D.C. I have clients overseas in London. So really my sphere of who I get to work with has also really opened up. There is so much less stress for me and my employees. I was somebody that used to commute from Saratoga to Albany most of my work life here in the Capital Region. I worked insane hours. So I worked crazy in the morning, like I was at work before 5 a.m. and I left work so that I could get my kids off of a bus. I didn't hit those traffic cycles as often as everybody else did, but when I did, it actually took the life out of me for quite some time. So I remember just last week, there was a snowstorm around 3 o'clock that really shut down Saratoga quite a bit. And all I was thinking is, oh my God, thank God I'm not on the Northway right now. It would have taken me hours to get home. Those are hours that I no longer have to spend worrying about just being in my car and figuring out what the rest of my night is going to look like. So since I did start this in 2006, and I was such a little trendsetter, I will say that there were definite barriers that I needed to break down. Again, I was a manager at this time with my agency, and definitely something that I continued on as I was the CFO, but I had a board that I needed to report to, and I had multiple supervisors when I was a manager that I needed to report to. And I definitely had to break down a lot of the barriers that a lot of us had to go through in 2020. I'm telling you right now, whether you do remote or not, this 9 to 5 punching in and having to see a person be in person and sitting at a desk, like Jen said, busy and productive are two very different things. So if you think just because you're seeing somebody sitting at their desk means that they're being productive for your company, they're not. It should not be your litmus test as to whether or not somebody is working for you. Another barrier was if you're working from home, you're not really working. Are you watching TV? Are you doing laundry? Are you doing your dishes? If you're working in the office, are you hanging out with your employees a whole bunch of time? Are you having really long lunches? Are you spending 20, 35 minutes catching up in the morning, taking a break in the afternoon, and none of those breaks really count as breaks? I'm going to throw it right back at you. Is every single second that they're spending in that office, every single second that they're spending working? Probably not. The final breaker was that employees won't care if they're not seeing you as an employee. So they won't care if they're not actually in your building. And like Jen said, the opposite is happening. People are really trying to figure out how to balance this whole life work. And 2020 was a storm. Like we can't deny it. Everybody was expected to do everything. But we all kind of decided silently, and I'm going to say it out loud, that we weren't doing anything well. So if you are a parent, there is no way that you were running a business, being an employee, being an employer, trying to manage your kid's schedule. Maybe all of you were home. I sat in an office where my whole family sat in here with me. My husband was a teacher. He was teaching remotely. My kids were behind me doing school. I'm trying to build my business. It was a storm. I got to add being a bus driver to my resume, and we both got to add, he was already a teacher, but I got to add it to my resume. Listen, it was not for the weak of heart. But did I give up on my company? Did I give up on my employees? Did my employees give up? No, we got the work done because we managed through that flexibility. And we were really able to pivot so easily. And I know how much we all hate that word right now, but we were already doing this. We were already balancing the remote and having to do things kind of on off hours. So it really wasn't a big shock to our company because, again, little trendsetter than I am, we were already going down this path. So it was very easy to switch our clients who were on site to remote, and they got to see how easy it was for us to be remote. So what are some lessons and some things that we had to work through? So what was definitely has always worked for me is as soon as I went to the remote workforce, I was able to meet my employees where they were at. I reduced my stress as well as their stress, and I severely decreased my overhead, not only when I was running the agency, but now when I'm owning my own company. Some things that we definitely needed to do and implement, and every time I hear Jen talk and policies change and things change about this, Liz and I learned way more. And even as we did a run through together, we were both making notes last week to be like, oh, we need to add this and we need to add that. So it's always a learning process, but so is having employees sitting in your office with you at all times. Things change, policies change. So that's not an additional stress or burden that I've taken on myself. It's just, we need to keep learning how to do this. So one thing that we have definitely realized in 2021 is we really need the team to connect with each other. We need full team meetings, we need siloed team meetings, and we need meetings with supervisors. We need to make sure that the remote lifestyle does work for our new hires. We need to ask them things like, do you have an office? Do you have an ability to work from home? What are the hours that you're able to work from home? Do those hours align with what my clients need? We really need to reimagine work-life balance and meeting people where they are right now. And not only is communication super important with your team, if you are going remote, which is how I started my company, you need to make sure that your clients are aware of what you are doing on their accounts. If they are not seeing you, if you are an outsourced connection for them, they need to know, because they can't see it, what you've done for them that week and what your priorities are the following week. It helps them to feel like they still have a team that's looking over and taking care of their accounts. So some recommendations, and Jen talked about this too. Communication is key. You need to communicate with your workforce. You need to communicate with your clients. You need to let them know clear expectations. When are they expected to work? When are they expected to get back to a client? We have an expectation that if you receive an email by 5 p.m., that email needs to be returned to the client. If you receive an email from me or from one of your supervisors, that has to be turned around in 24 hours. If they didn't know that, they could be left to feel like, oh, I can answer that at any time. You need to plan accordingly for this. You need to set yourself up well. So you need to have maybe a proper CRM tool, or you need to have a way to really keep track of who's in charge of what. That could be simple spreadsheets. I love a spreadsheet, they're my jam. You need to make sure that your team still feels like a team. They have people that they can rely on. They have coworkers that they can talk to and talk through some situations, and they have supervisors that they can turn to when needed. And that was it for me in my two kind of, personal ways that I've managed a remote workforce. But we do only have a couple minutes left. If you do have any questions, you can certainly throw them in the chat box. If it's something that's confidential, Jen and I certainly understand that. So we want to make sure you have our contact information. This is our email address and telephone numbers of how you can get a hold of all of us directly. Jen is a superstar in what she does. I cannot say enough about her and her company. They are our outsourced HR department and really have helped us. And like I said, we learned so much from them. So please feel free to touch base with her at any time. We are going to be handing out handouts. So what some templates that I will be handing out is staff assignments, how to keep track of what my staff is working on. Again, something I would need to do whether we're remote or on site. Timekeepers that we use, we do not, there are definite payroll companies that you can keep track where every single employee is assigned to a certain account, and maybe they have multiple accounts so they can go in and track their time based on the accounts. We do that differently. We do it through a timesheet. Just because we need a lot of information behind those hours and very specific summaries around those hours. So they would have to do it this way for us anyway. So instead of having them do it twice, we just have them do it once, and then we log all of those hours and plug them into our payroll. But there are payroll companies that do this all for you on the back end. But we'll share with you our timekeeper, and then Jen also has a template that she's going to be sharing. Jen, if you want to touch base on that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sabrina. And right back at you. I mean, you and your team are amazing, and I appreciate the opportunity today. So one thing that we've developed at Integra that we'll be sharing is it's a nice guide for supervisors and managers with their staff who are working remotely, and it also addresses if they're quarantined. So what we should be doing while an employee is quarantined, whether it's because of illness or whether they're quarantined and still able to work. So it's a nice guide and tool. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions now, or again, if it's confidential or you just want to reach out to me separately, I'm happy to do that for any of the participants today, now or going forward.
And it doesn't look like we have any questions. So we've had the contact information up for a little while. Hopefully you've had a chance to jot that down. As Sabrina and Jen said, please feel free to reach out at any time if there's any way that we can help you. And we will be following up with an email with those handouts. So we want to thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a great day.